The air in Clearwater County wasn't just dry, it was angry. It was a sandpaper wind that scoured the dust off the plains and threw it in your face, a wind that made the horizon shimmer and lie to you about what was coming. Calder Hayes stood on the warped boards of the lawyer's porch, a sealed envelope in one hand and a choice that tasted like rust in his mouth. The paper was heavy. It felt like a tombstone. It was the last will and testament of his half-brother, Grady Hale, a man who'd given him a job as a foreman but never once called him family. Grady, taken by a rattlesnake bite to the thigh. The venom had stolen his voice before it took his life, but not before he'd dictated this final cruel joke to the town lawyer, Marcus Thorne. Calder had been in Thorne's dusty office just an hour ago. He'd watched the old lawyer slide the single sheet of paper across the oak desk, and he'd read the 2 sentences that blew his world apart. The first sentence was a shock. A miracle. I leave the Hale Ranch in its entirety to Calder Hayes, my half-brother and foreman of 13 years. 13 years of sweat and blood, of being treated like a hired hand with the wrong last name. And now, the whole thing was his. 2,000 acres of prime Texas land. It was everything he'd ever wanted. But then came the second sentence. The poison in the gift. On the condition that he marry Nora Quinn of Boston, my intended bride, due to arrive within the week. Calder had read it a dozen times, and each time the words coiled tighter in his gut. Marry a woman he'd never met. A mail-order bride his brother had ordered like a new saddle. A stranger from Boston who was expecting to marry the wealthy ranch owner, Grady Hale, not the bastard half-brother who ran the place. He'd ridden back to the ranch with the will burning a hole in his pocket. He'd killed a bottle of whiskey trying to make sense of it, trying to decide if Grady had honored him or cursed him. Now, a week later, he was back in town, staring down the long dirt road, waiting for the stagecoach, waiting for his fate to arrive in a cloud of dust. He knew almost nothing about her. Nora Quinn. He'd seen her name on a letter once. Grady had laughed, calling her a woman with fire in her letters, but desperate enough to cross a continent for a man she's never seen. That was it. That was all he knew about the woman he was supposed to make his wife. The whole town knew. Of course they did. News in Clearwater spread faster than a prairie fire. The bastard's son was inheriting the Hale Ranch, but only if he married his dead brother's mail-order bride. They were all out here, pretending not to watch. Leaning on posts, loitering outside the general store, their eyes wide with the hungry curiosity of a small town smelling drama. "She late?" Doc Rollins asked, stepping out of his clinic, wiping his hands on a rag. "She's coming," Calder muttered, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "See the dust?" "You could still back out," the doc said, his voice low. "No one would blame you. Hell, most of the folks who owe Grady money would probably thank you for putting that land back up for sale." Calder's jaw tightened. "I gave my word to the lawyer, and that land ain't for sale." Just then, the stagecoach appeared, a black speck growing larger against the shimmering heat. It rattled into town, pulled by 2 exhausted horses and ground to a halt. The driver, a leathery man named Bo, hopped down. "Got your cargo, Hayes," he grunted, tipping his hat. "And from the sound of it, she's got a whole lot of questions." The coach door creaked open. Calder felt his throat go tight. The town held its breath. A salesman got out first, then a frail woman in a ridiculous hat. And then a hand appeared, gloved, pale, and steady. It gripped the doorframe with an unnerving confidence. The woman who stepped out didn't stumble. She descended as if she were stepping onto a ballroom floor, not the dusty main street of a nowhere town. Her dress was a deep, severe green. Her auburn hair was pinned in a tight, controlled style. Calder had expected a woman worn down by desperation. He was wrong. What he saw was steel. Her eyes, the color of a stormy sky, swept over the gawking crowd, dismissing them. When her gaze finally landed on Calder, it wasn't with hope or fear. It was with calculation. She knew exactly who he was. She walked toward him, her back ramrod straight, her chin high. She didn't look like she was walking toward a prospective husband. She looked like she was walking toward a confrontation. "Mr. Hayes," she said. Her voice was low and clear, her Boston accent clipping the words like sharp scissors. "I am Nora Quinn." Calder tipped his hat, his mind racing. "Ma'am, I'm sorry for your loss. Grady, he spoke of you." It was a lie, a weak attempt at kindness. She didn't buy it. "I was informed there have been complications." "Yes, ma'am," Calder said, his voice flat. "Grady asked me to honor his promise to you. If you're willing, the Reverend is expecting us." Her expression didn't change, but her fingers tightened on the handle of her small travel bag. "And if I'm not willing?" The question hung in the air, a direct challenge in front of half the town. Calder hadn't expected it. He hadn't expected any of this. "Then I'll pay your fare back to Boston, or wherever you want to go," he said, meeting her stare. "No obligation, but you came a long way. I reckon you weren't hoping to be sent right back." She studied him for a long, silent moment. The crowd leaned in, straining to hear. "Before I make any decision," she said, her voice dropping lower, just for him, "I require a private conversation. I will not be bartered for like property in the middle of the street." She then glanced around at the dusty town, her lip curling in faint disgust. "Is there anywhere in this desolate place that offers a bit of civility?" Calder nodded toward the general store. "Back room's empty. Murphy closed for the day." As they walked, the crowd parted like the Red Sea. The whispers followed them, a venomous hiss on the wind. Calder ignored them. He was a man walking into a trap, and the strangest part was, the woman beside him looked like she was the one setting it. The back room of Murphy's store smelled of coffee, cedar, and secrets. A single beam of dusty sunlight cut through the gloom, illuminating the worn floorboards. Nora Quinn didn't wait for Calder. She strode to the center of the room, placed her travel bag on a barrel, and turned to face him, her arms crossed. She hadn't removed her gloves. She hadn't even looked for a chair. She looked like a general surveying a battlefield. "All right, Mr. Hayes," she began, her voice sharp and devoid of any pleasantries. "Let's dispense with the charade. Your brother is dead. The arrangement I made is void. So tell me, why on God's green earth did you agree to this absurd codicil in his will?" Straight to the point. No grief, no fear, just cold, hard business. Calder found himself respecting it, even as it set his teeth on edge. "I gave my word," he said, his voice a low rumble. It was his dying wish. She let out a short, incredulous laugh. "A dying wish? Or a final curse? Let me guess. He never liked you much. The half-brother, the foreman, always in his shadow. And now he hands you the world but ties you to a complete stranger. It's a poetic kind of cruelty, isn't it?" Calder stiffened. She saw too much. "What I thought of my brother is my business." "It's my business now," she shot back, "if you expect me to chain my life to yours. So let's be clear. What do you really want from me?" He looked around the cramped room, at the sacks of flour and barrels of nails. "A wife, in name. That's what the will demands. You get a home, half of what the ranch is worth, legally. Security. I run the place. You live in the house. We stay out of each other's way. It's a business arrangement." She took a step closer, her stormy eyes narrowing. "I didn't travel 2,000 miles to be a silent partner in a business arrangement, Mr. Hayes. I had a life in Boston. I had prospects." "Then why are you here?" Calder challenged. "Why answer an ad from a stranger in Texas?" For the first time, a flicker of something else crossed her face. A shadow. "My reasons are my own. Just know that I am not some helpless creature you can install in your house like a piece of furniture." She tapped a gloved finger on her travel bag. "I came here for a new beginning, not a new cage. If I agree to this, there will be conditions. My conditions." Calder waited, his jaw tight. "First," she said, "the ranch's books. I want to see them, all of them. I will not be married to a failing enterprise." Calder blinked. "The ranch is fine. I will be the judge of that," she said. "Second, I am a partner, not a possession. My opinion will be heard on all matters concerning the ranch. Third, I will have my own room, separate. The arrangement is in name only. Is that understood? This was not a desperate mail-order bride. This was a negotiation, a hostile takeover. Calder should have felt angry, trapped. Instead, he felt a strange, grudging admiration. She had spine, more spine than Grady ever did. Fine, he said. The books are at the house. You can have any room you want. Good, she said, her posture relaxing slightly. She finally unclasped her hands. There is one more thing. The man who owned the land next to yours, a Mr. Kane, Jedediah Kane. My brother mentioned him in his letters. He said he was a problem. Calder's blood went cold. Jedediah Kane wasn't just a problem. He was a cancer, a rival rancher who'd been trying to get his hands on the Hale land for years, using threats and intimidation. Grady had always been terrified of him. Kane is my problem, not yours, Calder said, his voice hard. If I marry you, Mr. Hayes, your problems become my problems, she corrected him. I need to know what I'm walking into. Is this man a danger to me? Calder thought of Kane's cold eyes, his cruel smile. He thought of the fence lines Kane's men had cut, the wells they'd fouled. He's a danger to everyone, he admitted, but he won't touch you. I'll see to that. She held his gaze for a long moment, seeming to weigh his words, his soul. Then, she gave a single, sharp nod. Very well, Mr. Hayes. It seems we have an arrangement. I accept your proposal. She extended a gloved hand. It wasn't an invitation. It was the sealing of a contract. He took it. Her grip was firm, cool, and surprisingly strong. Calder, he said. My name is Calder. Nora, she replied, though it didn't sound like she was sharing. It sounded like a statement of fact. An hour later, they stood before Reverend Hart. The church was empty except for 2 reluctant witnesses pulled from the saloon. Nora wore the same green dress, her expression as unreadable as a stone. Calder stood beside her, feeling the weight of the town's judgment, the ghost of his brother's laughter, and the unnerving presence of the woman who was now, legally, his wife. The Reverend pronounced them man and wife. Calder hesitated, then leaned in and brushed his lips against her cheek. It was like kissing marble. She didn't flinch, but she didn't soften either. As they stepped out of the church into the setting sun, a man was waiting for them across the street. He was leaning against a post, a cheroot dangling from his lips. Tall, broad-shouldered, with eyes that missed nothing. Jedediah Kane. He pushed off the post and walked toward them, his boots silent in the dust. He stopped a few feet away, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. He ignored Calder completely. His eyes were locked on Nora. Well, well, Kane said, his voice a low drawl. Grady's little mail-order bride. I have to say, you're not what I was expecting. He looked her up and down, his gaze lingering. A whole lot more fire. I can see this is going to be far more interesting than I thought. He tipped his hat, but it wasn't a gesture of respect, it was a warning. Then he finally looked at Calder, his smile turning into a sneer. Enjoy the honeymoon, Hayes, because the ranch won't be yours for long. Kane turned and walked away, disappearing into the twilight, leaving Calder and his new bride standing in the sudden cold. Calder looked at Nora. Her face was a pale mask in the fading light, but her eyes were burning with an intensity that chilled him to the bone. He had thought this marriage was a trap set by his dead brother. He was just beginning to realize it was something far more dangerous. And the woman beside him was right in the middle of it. The ride to the ranch was a long, silent battle. Calder sat hunched over the reins of the wagon, the sound of Jedediah Kane's threat echoing in his head. Beside him, Nora was a statue of green fabric and rigid posture. She stared straight ahead, watching the endless plains roll by, her face giving away nothing. The Hale Ranch appeared as the moon rose, a collection of dark shapes against a sea of silver grass. The main house was 2 stories of limestone and cedar, solid and imposing. A fortress. Grady had built it to show off his wealth. But tonight it just felt isolated, vulnerable. As they pulled up, a small, wiry man with graying hair stepped out of the barn, holding a lantern. Hector. He'd been with the ranch longer than Calder. His face was a road map of worry. "Calder," he said, his eyes flicking to Nora. "Kane's men were here." Calder was out of the wagon in a second. "What happened?" "Rode the southern fence line, just watching," Hector said, and a message came, from the lawyer, Thorne. He handed Calder a folded piece of paper. Calder read it by the lantern light. His blood ran cold. A creditor has come forward. A significant debt owed by Grady. Payment due in 30 days, or the ranch is forfeit. A debt. A huge one. Grady had never said a word. It was a lie. It had to be a lie. But Kane's smiling face flashed in his mind. This was his opening move. Bleed them dry. "Who's the creditor?" Calder asked, his voice tight. Hector shook his head. "Thorne didn't say. Just that the paperwork is ironclad." Calder crushed the note in his fist. He was trapped. He'd inherited a poisoned chalice, a ranch on the brink of collapse, with a predator circling. He turned to look at his new wife, who had stepped down from the wagon and was watching the exchange, her expression unreadable. "It seems, Mr. Hayes," Nora said, her voice cutting through the night air, "that your problems are even bigger than you let on." "This changes nothing," Calder bit out. "Oh, I believe it changes everything," she retorted, picking up her travel bag. "It means my investment is at risk." She walked past him toward the house, her steps sure and steady. "I will see those books, tonight." Inside, the house was cold and dark. It smelled of leather, wood smoke, and loneliness. A woman appeared from the kitchens, wiping her hands on an apron. Rosa, Hector's wife, the heart of the house. Her warm smile faltered when she saw Nora's face. Nora didn't wait for introductions. "Where are your husband's ledgers?" she asked Calder, her voice echoing in the grand, empty room. He led her to Grady's study, a dark, masculine room dominated by a massive oak desk. He lit a lamp, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Bookshelves were filled with leather-bound volumes Grady had never read. Calder pulled a heavy ledger from a locked drawer and slammed it onto the desk. "There, see for yourself. The ranch is solvent." Nora removed her gloves, one finger at a time, with chilling precision. She sat in Grady's chair, pulled the ledger toward her, and opened it. For the next hour, the only sound was the scratching of her pen on a spare sheet of paper and the soft turn of the pages. Calder paced the room like a caged animal. Hector and Rosa hovered by the door, watching with wide, worried eyes. Finally, Nora looked up. The lamplight caught the hard planes of her face. "This is a work of fiction," she said quietly. "What?" Calder growled. "The numbers," she said, tapping a page. "They're illusions. Grady was reporting inflated cattle counts to the bank. He was logging supply purchases that were never made. He was moving money around, creating a phantom of prosperity. But based on these figures, the ranch has been bleeding money for at least a year. This debt isn't a surprise attack, Calder. It's the final nail in a coffin he built himself." Calder stared at her, stunned. Grady, a fraud? It didn't make sense. "But there's something else," Nora continued, her eyes narrowing as she stared at the page. "These withdrawals, large sums of cash, weekly, unaccounted for. Where was all that money going?" Before Calder could answer, Rosa gasped from the doorway. "El fantasma," she whispered, crossing herself. "The ghost." Hector put a hand on her arm. "Rosa, no." "What ghost?" Nora demanded, her gaze snapping to the older woman. "It is what we called it," Rosa said, her voice trembling. "The money Mr. Grady paid, to keep the secrets buried. He paid it every month to a man who came in the night. A man with a scarred face." Calder and Hector exchanged a look of dawning horror. They both knew a man with a scarred face, one of Kane's most brutal enforcers. Grady wasn't just in debt. He was being blackmailed by Jedediah Kane. "What secret?" Calder demanded, turning to Hector. "What did Kane have on him?" Hector looked at the floor, his loyalty to his dead boss warring with the truth. I don't know for sure, but it was something that happened years ago. Something bad. Grady said it was a mistake that cost a man his life. A dead man, blackmail, a mountain of debt, a 30-day deadline. Calder felt the walls of the study closing in. His inheritance wasn't a ranch. It was a landmine. He looked at Nora. She wasn't looking at him. She was staring at the ledger, her brow furrowed in intense concentration. She was tracing the numbers, her mind working, connecting dots he couldn't even see. This isn't just about money, she murmured, almost to herself. This pattern, it's not random. She suddenly looked up, her eyes locking onto his. He wasn't just paying Kane off. He was hiding something in the land itself, the numbers that are faked, the supply orders for things the ranch doesn't need. They correspond to specific sections of the property, the northern ridge, the dry creek bed. He was creating a paper trail to explain his presence in those areas. What was he doing? Calder breathed. I don't know, she said, but whatever it is, I'd bet my life it's what Kane is really after, and it's what got your brother killed. The word hung in the air. Killed. Calder had thought the rattlesnake was an accident, a tragic piece of bad luck. But now, seeing it all laid out, the blackmail, the debt, Kane's smug confidence, he knew. Grady hadn't been bitten. He'd been murdered. And he, Calder, had just married the one woman who could expose the entire conspiracy. Or become its next victim. The next few days were a quiet storm. An unspoken truce settled over the house. By day, they were partners in a desperate gamble. Calder and Hector rode the fence lines, armed and watchful, their eyes constantly scanning the horizon for Kane's men. Nora, to Calder's astonishment, took over the ranch's operations with brutal efficiency. She seemed to need no sleep. She spent hours with the ledgers, her notes and calculations spreading across the dining room table like a general's war map. She cut expenses, renegotiated supply costs with a ferocity that made seasoned traders stammer, and accounted for every last bullet and bean. She found a dozen ways Grady had been cheated by his suppliers. All of them, she noted, men with ties to Jedediah Kane. She was saving them pennies while a tidal wave of debt threatened to drown them. But it was something. It was a fight. One afternoon, Calder found her in the barn, not with the books, but with a skittish mare Grady had never been able to tame. Nora was speaking to the horse in a low, calm voice, her hand held out, palm open. The horse, which usually shied from everyone, took a hesitant step forward and nuzzled her hand. How did you do that? Calder asked, his voice rough with surprise. Animals know when you're not a threat, she said, not looking at him. She stroked the mare's neck. They also know when you're lying. People are much the same. The comment hung in the air between them, a reminder that they were allies, not friends, strangers bound by a dead man's will and a common enemy. The threat of Kane was constant, a shadow at the edge of their vision. One morning they found a dozen of their cattle dead by a poisoned watering hole. Another night, a fire broke out in the hayloft. They put it out before it could take the whole barn, but the message was clear. We can touch you whenever we want. The pressure was building, a suffocating weight. The 30-day deadline was a ticking clock, and through it all, Nora remained an enigma. She worked, she planned, she fought for the ranch with a strange, fierce possessiveness, but she revealed nothing of herself. Her past was a locked door. One night, unable to sleep, Calder found himself in Grady's study. He was looking for something, anything his brother might have left behind, a clue, a weapon. He ran his hands along the bookshelves, pulling out books at random. That's when he saw it. Tucked behind a row of unread classics was a small, locked wooden box. He didn't have the key, but a rancher's hands are strong. He pried the lid open. Inside, nestled on a bed of velvet, were letters, a stack of them, tied with a blue ribbon. The return address was Boston. They were Nora's letters to Grady. His heart pounded. Here finally was a piece of her, a window into the woman he'd married. He untied the ribbon and pulled out the first letter. The handwriting was elegant, looping, full of flourishes. He began to read. "My dearest Grady," the letter began, "your description of the Texas sunset sounds like a painting. I long to see it for myself, to escape the noise and soot of this city and find peace in the open spaces you write of." He read another. "I confess the thought of managing a household so large is daunting, but I am a quick study. I've been reading books on animal husbandry. Did you know that?" Calder frowned. He read a third and then a fourth. The voice in these letters was gentle, hopeful, a little naive. It was the voice of a woman seeking refuge, a woman dreaming of a quiet life. It was a voice he had never heard. Because it wasn't Nora's. The woman he had married, the woman with eyes like a storm and a mind like a steel trap, had never written these words. The handwriting was completely different from the sharp, analytical script that filled her notebooks in the dining room. He stood there, in the silent, lamp-lit study, the letters trembling in his hand. Everything was a lie. Her name, her story, her very presence here. The woman sleeping in his brother's house was an imposter. A cold dread washed over him. He had married a stranger, a fraud. But if she wasn't Nora Quinn, then who was she? And what had happened to the real Nora, the woman who had written these hopeful, trusting letters to his brother? He stormed out of the study and down the hall to the dining room. She was there, as always, bent over the ledgers under the single lamp, a cup of cold coffee at her elbow. She looked up as he entered, her expression wary. He didn't say a word. He just threw the letters onto the table in front of her. They scattered across her neat columns of numbers. Her face went pale. All the color drained from her cheeks, leaving her skin as white as bone. She stared at the letters, then up at him, and for the first time since she'd arrived, Calder saw fear in her eyes. Raw, naked fear. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice a low, dangerous growl. She didn't answer. She just stared at him, her composure shattered, her defenses gone. "I asked you a question," he said, taking a step closer. The air crackled between them. "Those letters, they're not yours. The handwriting isn't yours. The woman who wrote them, she's not you. So you're going to tell me who you are, and you're going to tell me right now. Or so help me God, I will throw you out of this house and let Cain have you." Her chin trembled, but she lifted it, a spark of her old fire returning. "You wouldn't do that." "Try me," he hissed. "I'm tired of the lies. I'm tired of the secrets. My brother is dead, my ranch is on the line, and I have a complete stranger living under my roof. The games are over." She stood up, her hands gripping the back of her chair. She looked cornered, trapped. "You don't understand." "Then make me understand," he roared, slamming his hand on the table, making the letters jump. She flinched. A long, shuddering breath escaped her lips. She closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them again, the fear was gone, replaced by a profound, heartbreaking sadness. "My name is Alara," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Nora was my sister, my younger sister." Calder stared, his mind reeling. A sister? "She's the one who answered Grady's advertisement," Alara continued, her voice gaining a little strength. "She was the gentle one, the hopeful one. She wanted a new life, away from Boston, away from him." "Him," Calder pressed. "A man our father owed a great deal of money to, a cruel, vicious man. When our father died, the debt passed to us. He saw Nora. He wanted her, not as a wife, as a payment." Alara's hands clenched into fists. "The matrimonial agency was her only escape. Your brother's offer was a lifeline. I helped her plan it. I helped her pack." She paused, swallowing hard. "We were supposed to travel together as far as St. Louis, but the night before we were to leave, he came to our apartment. He was drunk, furious that Nora was trying to slip through his fingers. He tried to force her." The room was deathly quiet. Calder could hear the clock ticking on the mantel, a cold, metallic heartbeat. "I stopped him," Alara said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. "I hit him. I hit him with a fireplace poker. I didn't mean to. I just wanted him to stop hurting her. But he fell, and he didn't get up." Calder felt the air leave his lungs. "We panicked," she whispered. "We knew no one would believe us. A powerful man like that, against two penniless sisters? So we ran. We took what little money we had and we ran. I put Nora on the first stagecoach heading west. I told her to go to Grady, to be safe. I was going to follow, take a different route." She looked at him, her eyes pleading for him to understand. "But she never made it. There was an accident. The coach overturned in a storm in the mountains. I read about it in a newspaper a week later. They said there were no survivors." The words hit Calder like a physical blow. No survivors. The real Nora was dead. "I was alone," Alara breathed. "Hunted. I had my sister's ticket, her identity. It was my only chance, so I became her. I came here, intending to tell your brother the truth, to beg for his help. But I arrived to find him dead, and you holding that will." She sank back into her chair, the story finally told. She was not a predator. She was a refugee, a murderer and a fraud, but one born of desperation and love. Calder stood there, the foundations of his anger crumbling away, replaced by a dizzying mix of pity and confusion. He had been played, yes, but not by a villain, by a survivor. Before he could process it, before he could say a word, the front door of the house burst open with a deafening crash. Jedediah Kane stood silhouetted in the doorway, two of his men behind him. He held a pistol in his hand, and he was smiling that same, slow, predatory smile. "Well now," Kane drawled, his eyes fixing on Alara's terrified face. "Isn't this a touching little confession?" He took a step into the room, his gaze sweeping over the scattered letters, the ledgers, the fear on their faces. "The thing about running from your past, little girl," he said, his smile widening as he looked directly at Alara, "is that you can't run from me." He let the name hang in the air, a death sentence. "I was the man in Boston. Your father's debt was to me, and you didn't just run. You killed my brother." Kane's words hit the room like a shotgun blast. Not just a powerful man, not just a creditor, Kane's brother. Calder looked from Kane's triumphant, hate-filled face to Alara's, which had gone beyond pale to a ghastly, translucent white. The trap hadn't just been sprung. It had been waiting for her since the moment she fled Boston. "Surprised?" Kane mocked, taking another slow step into the room. His men fanned out behind him, blocking any escape. "You thought you could disappear in this backwater? I have eyes everywhere. When I heard Grady Hale's mail-order bride was coming from Boston, I had my suspicions, but I never dreamed you'd be foolish enough to deliver yourself right to my doorstep." He was no longer just a rival rancher. He was an avenger. The debt, the blackmail against Grady, it was all a prelude. This was personal. This was about blood. "The debt your brother owed me is nothing," Kane sneered at Calder. "The ranch is just dirt and wood. What I want is justice for my family." His eyes, cold and black as a snake's, drilled into Alara. "And I'm going to take it out of your hide." Calder moved, instinctively placing himself between Kane and Alara. "This is my house, Kane. Get out." Kane laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Your house? This whole place is built on a foundation of my money and your brother's cowardice. Did he ever tell you the real secret he was hiding? The one I was blackmailing him over?" Calder stood his ground, his fists clenched. "I don't care about Grady's secrets." "Oh, you should," Kane said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Because it involves a dead man, a government surveyor. Grady and I were partners in a little side business years ago, rustling cattle from across the border. This surveyor got wise to us. Grady panicked. There was an argument. The surveyor ended up with a bullet in his back." Kane shrugged. "Grady buried him up on the northern ridge. He's been paying me for my silence ever since. He was so terrified of that secret getting out, he did whatever I told him." The pieces slammed together in Calder's mind. The fake supply orders. The trips to the northern ridge. Grady wasn't hiding something. He was hiding someone. The snake bite, Calder said, the realization dawning on him. It wasn't an accident. Kane's smile was chilling. Grady was getting weak, talking about coming clean. He was becoming a liability. A rattlesnake is a lot cleaner than a bullet. No one asks questions. Murder. It had all been murder. And now the murderer was standing in his house, holding a gun, with his sights set on the woman Calder had sworn to protect. So here's how this is going to go, Kane said, his businesslike tone making it all the more terrifying. She, he nodded at Alara, is coming with me. We have some unfinished business. You, he looked at Calder, will sign the deed to this ranch over to me, to clear Grady's outstanding debt. You walk away with your life. Try to be a hero, and you'll end up in the ground next to your brother. Hector and Rosa were huddled in the doorway, Rosa clutching a crucifix, Hector's face grim and pale. There was no way out. They were outmanned, outgunned. Calder's mind raced. He had no plan, no weapon. All he had was a promise he'd made to a dead man, and the unexpected, fierce urge to protect the woman of lies standing behind him. He looked at Alara. Her fear was still there, but underneath it, a familiar fire was igniting in her eyes. The fire of a cornered animal. She wasn't just a victim. She was a fighter. She had been fighting her whole life. No, Alara said, her voice shaking but clear. Kane turned his head slowly as if surprised she dared to speak. What did you say? I said no, she repeated, stepping out from behind Calder to face him. You will not have this ranch, and you will not have me. Kane's face contorted with rage. You stupid girl. You have no idea what I'm capable of. And you have no idea what I am capable of, she shot back. And then she did something that shocked everyone. She smiled. It was a cold, brittle, terrifying smile. You think Grady was afraid of you? She said, her voice dripping with scorn. He was playing you, you arrogant fool. He wasn't just paying you off. He was documenting everything, every payment, every threat, every crime you ever made him a part of. Kane faltered, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. What are you talking about? You're bluffing. Am I? Alara's eyes darted to the massive stone fireplace that dominated the room. Why do you think he built this monstrosity? It's not just for heat. Calder followed her gaze. The fireplace. He'd never paid it much mind. It was just another of Grady's grand, useless gestures. But now he looked closer. One of the stones near the base. It was slightly discolored. The mortar around it looked newer, different from the rest. Kane saw it too. His eyes widened in horrified realization. There's a ledger, Alara said, pressing her advantage, her voice ringing with confidence she couldn't possibly feel. Hidden inside, a full account of your entire criminal enterprise, the rustling, the blackmail, the murder of the surveyor, the murder of Grady Hale. It's all in there. And I know exactly where it is. It was a brilliant, desperate bluff, a gamble to throw Kane off balance, to buy them a few precious seconds. And it worked. Kane's face, which had been a mask of smug certainty, was now twisted with doubt and fury. He couldn't risk it. He couldn't risk that she was telling the truth. Get it, he snarled at his men. Tear the whole damn thing down if you have to. As Kane's two goons lunged toward the fireplace with crowbars they'd brought from their saddles, all hell broke loose. It was the opening Calder had been waiting for. He didn't go for Kane. He went for the lamp. With a single, swift motion, he grabbed the big oil lamp from the table and hurled it at Kane's men. It shattered against the stone hearth, and a wave of fire erupted, engulfing the two men in flames. Their screams were horrifying. In that instant of chaos, Hector, the quiet, wiry foreman, moved with the speed of a striking snake. He wasn't holding a gun. He was holding a coiled bullwhip that had been hanging by the door. With a flick of his wrist, the whip shot out, its leather tip cracking like a gunshot as it wrapped around the pistol in Kane's hand, yanking it from his grasp. The gun clattered across the floor. Kane roared in fury and pain, turning on Hector. But he never made it. Calder was on him, tackling him with the force of a battering ram. The two men crashed to the floor, a tangle of limbs and grunts and raw violence. Calder was driven by 13 years of resentment for his brother, fueled by the rage of Cain's murders, and powered by a desperate need to protect the life he was just beginning to build. He was stronger. He drove his fist into Cain's face, once, twice. Cain fought back, clawing, kicking, but Calder's fury was a force of nature. He got Cain in a chokehold, squeezing the life and the lies out of the man who had tormented his family. Suddenly, a gunshot exploded in the small room, deafeningly loud. Calder froze. He felt a sharp, searing pain in his shoulder. He looked down. Blood was soaking through his shirt. One of Cain's men, though badly burned, had managed to retrieve his pistol. But he wasn't aiming at Calder anymore. He was aiming at Alara. Before the man could fire again, a dark shape flew through the air. A fireplace poker. The one Alara had used in Boston. Rosa, the small, quiet woman who had been cowering by the door, had thrown it with all her might. It struck the gunman in the temple, and he crumpled to the floor, silent. The fight was over. Cain was unconscious, bleeding on the floor. His men were either down or dead. The room was filled with smoke, the smell of burnt flesh, and the ringing silence of victory. Calder staggered to his feet, clutching his shoulder, the pain a dull, throbbing roar. He looked at Alara. She was pale, shaking, but she was alive. Their eyes met across the ruined room. "The ledger," he croaked. "Was it real?" She shook her head, a slow, weary smile touching her lips. "I had no idea. But I figured a man like Grady had to have an insurance policy somewhere." He let out a weak laugh, which turned into a grimace of pain. He started to sway. "Calder!" Alara rushed to his side, catching him as his knees buckled. "Get the doc," he mumbled, his vision starting to tunnel. "And the sheriff. Tell him we've got some trash to take out." As he slipped into darkness, the last thing he saw was Alara's face. Her stormy eyes filled not with fear or calculation, but with a fierce, unwavering concern. It was a look he was starting to realize he would die for. Doc Rollins patched Calder up with grumbling efficiency, pulling the bullet from his shoulder and pouring whiskey on the wound until Calder nearly passed out again. The sheriff, a portly man named Gable, who had always been a little too friendly with Cain, arrived looking pale and nervous. He saw the scene, Cain and his men tied up, the scorched fireplace, the blood on the floor, and listened with wide eyes as Alara, calm and composed once more, laid out the entire story. She didn't mention her own past. She focused on Cain, the blackmail, the murders. "The proof," she said, her voice steady, "is in the fireplace." Gable looked doubtful, but Calder, gritting his teeth against the pain, nodded. "Check it." With the help of Hector, the sheriff pried loose the stone Alara had pointed to, and there, in a small hollowed-out cavity, was a tin box. Inside was Grady's second ledger. It was all there. Dates, names, amounts, a meticulous record of Cain's crimes, written in Grady's precise hand. It was an indictment from the grave. Cain's entire empire of fear came crashing down. Faced with irrefutable proof, Sheriff Gable had no choice. He hauled Cain and his surviving man to the county jail. Clearwater was free. In the quiet aftermath, the house slowly returned to a semblance of normal. The 30-day deadline on the debt came and went. It had been a fiction created by Cain, and it vanished with his arrest. The ranch was safe. It was theirs. One evening, a week later, Calder found Alara on the front porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. His arm was in a sling, but the pain had dulled to a manageable ache. He stood beside her, not speaking for a long time. The silence between them was different now, comfortable, easy. "You never told me," he said finally, "about your sister, the real Nora. What was she like?" Alara smiled, a sad, gentle expression. "She was everything I'm not. kind, soft-spoken. She trusted people. She saw the good in the world, even when it showed her its worst. She looked at him. She would have liked you, and she would have loved this place. "I'm sorry," Calder said, and he meant it. Sorry for her loss, sorry for his own ignorance. "I am too," she whispered, "but lying about who I was. It was the only way I knew how to survive." "You don't have to survive anymore," he said, his voice low. "You can live." He reached out with his good hand and took hers, her fingers curled around his, warm and strong. "You're Alara, and you're home." It should have been the end of the story. The villains were vanquished, the secrets were out, and the heroes were left to build a life on the land they had fought for. But fate had one last card to play. A month later, a telegram arrived. It wasn't addressed to Calder Hayes or the Hale Ranch. It was addressed to Miss Alara Quinn. Alara opened it with trembling fingers. She read it once, then twice, her face draining of all color. She handed it to Calder without a word. The telegram was from a hospital in Santa Fe, found in mountains, suffering from memory loss for months, just regained, asking for her sister. Come at once. It was signed, Nora Quinn. Nora was alive. The stagecoach accident. She had survived. A prospector had found her, delirious and broken, and had taken her to a doctor in a small mining town. Her memory was gone. She didn't know who she was or where she was going. For months, she had lived in a fog, her past a complete blank. Until now. Calder looked at Alara. Her face was a storm of warring emotions, shock, joy, and a new, terrible fear. The will. Grady's will was brutally specific. "I leave the Hale Ranch, on the condition that he marry Nora Quinn." His marriage to Alara, a woman who had used a false name, was legally void. The ranch, the life they had bled for, the home they had built, it all belonged to a woman he had never met. It belonged to the real Nora Quinn. Their victory had turned to ashes in an instant. To keep the ranch he now loved, not for the land but for the life it held, he would have to abandon the woman who had fought beside him. He would have to cast Alara aside and marry her sister. He looked at Alara, at the unshed tears shimmering in her stormy eyes, and he knew he was facing a choice more impossible than any bullet or threat from Cain. He could follow the letter of the law and keep his inheritance, or he could follow his heart and lose everything. The journey to Santa Fe was a blur of dust and dread. Calder and Alara barely spoke. What was there to say? They were riding toward a reunion that would tear their world apart. Every mile that brought them closer to Nora was another mile away from the life they had started to build. The hospital was a clean, quiet place that smelled of antiseptic and despair. A nurse led them to a small room with a window that looked out onto a sun-baked courtyard. A young woman was sitting in a chair by the window, a blanket over her lap. She had the same auburn hair as Alara, but her face was softer, her eyes a gentle hazel. When she saw Alara, her face broke into a radiant, tearful smile. "Alara, I knew you'd come." The two sisters embraced, a mess of sobs and whispered reassurances. Calder stood back, feeling like an intruder. This was Nora, the woman from the letters, the rightful bride of the Hale Ranch. After the tears subsided, Nora turned her gentle eyes to Calder. "You must be Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice soft. "Grady's brother. Alara told me everything. How you saved her. How you saved the ranch. Thank you." There was no artifice in her words, just pure, unadulterated gratitude. It was almost worse than if she'd been angry. They stayed in Santa Fe for 3 days, while Nora recovered her strength. Alara was constantly by her side, the two of them catching up on a year of lost time. Calder found himself taking long, solitary walks, the lawyer's words echoing in his head. The condition is absolute. Marry Nora Quinn. On the final evening, he found Alara alone in the courtyard. "We have to talk about this," he said, his voice heavy. "I know," she said, not looking at him. The ranch belongs to her if she marries you, I won't do it, Calder said fiercely. I won't cast you aside. We'll fight it. We'll find a lawyer. Ilara finally looked at him, her eyes filled with a terrible sadness. And what will we say, Calder? That we're entitled to it because we fought for it? Nora has lost everything, her home, a year of her life. I can't take this from her, too. It's all she has left. She doesn't have me, he said, his voice cracking. I love you, Ilara. The words, finally spoken, hung in the air between them. Her eyes widened, and tears began to stream down her face. I love you too, she whispered. Which is why you have to do this. You have to honor the will. You have to marry her. For me. It was an impossible choice, betray the woman he loved, or force her to sacrifice the only family she had left. The ride back to Clearwater was even more silent than the ride out. Nora, frail but happy, rode in the wagon with Ilara. Calder rode ahead on his horse, his heart a leaden weight in his chest. When they arrived, the whole town seemed to be waiting. Word had spread. The story had taken another unbelievable turn. The real bride had returned from the dead. Calder called a meeting. In his dining room, the same room where he had fought for his life, he gathered the key players. Ilara, Nora, Doc Rollins, Hector, Rosa, and even the now humbled Sheriff Gable. He laid it all out. The truth, the will, the impossible choice. According to the law, Calder said, his voice flat, my marriage to Ilara is invalid. To keep the ranch, I must marry Nora. Nora looked stunned, her gentle face pale with shock. Marry you? But I don't even know you, and you love my sister. The law doesn't care about love, Calder said grimly. Well, maybe it should, a voice boomed from the doorway. Marcus Thorne, the old lawyer, stood there, his face stern. He had written out as soon as he heard the news. I've been reviewing my notes from my meeting with Grady, and I think I found something. Everyone turned to him. Grady was a complicated man, Thorne said, stepping into the room. But he wasn't stupid. He knew Kane was a threat. He wrote that will as a last-ditch effort to protect the ranch and the woman he was coming to care for. He needed a strong man to run the place, someone Kane couldn't bully. That was you, Calder. Thorne opened his briefcase and pulled out a sheet of paper. It was a sworn affidavit he had taken from Grady on his deathbed. His wording was very specific, the lawyer said, putting on his spectacles. He said, I want the ranch to go to my brother, Calder, on the condition he honors my promise to the woman who arrives from Boston, identifying herself as Nora Quinn. A stunned silence fell over the room. The woman who arrives, identifying herself as Nora Quinn. It wasn't about blood. It wasn't about a specific person. It was about the act, the promise. Ilara had arrived. She had identified herself as Nora Quinn. She had fulfilled the condition. His marriage to Ilara was legal. It was valid. The ranch was theirs. Ilara burst into tears, a sound of pure, unadulterated relief. Calder crossed the room in 2 strides and pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her hair. Nora watched them, a slow, beautiful smile spreading across her face. She had not lost a home. She had gained a family. In the months that followed, the Hale Ranch wasn't just rebuilt. It was reborn. Nora, with her gentle spirit and love for learning, reopened the schoolhouse, with Ilara, who had confessed her own story to a forgiving town, helping her teach. The 2 sisters, once separated by tragedy, were now inseparable. Calder and Ilara ran the ranch not as a master and a wife in name, but as true partners. The quiet foreman had found his voice, and the woman running from her past had found a place to finally stand still. They expanded the horse breeding operation, their stock becoming known throughout the state for its strength and spirit. One evening, Calder stood on the porch, his arm around his wife, watching Nora read to a group of children under the big oak tree. The setting sun cast a golden glow over everything, and the air was filled with the sounds of laughter and life. Who would have thought, Calder said, his voice filled with a quiet awe, that a dead man's curse would turn out to be the greatest blessing of my life. Ilara leaned her head on his shoulder. "It wasn't a curse, my love," she said softly. "It was just a very complicated love story, waiting for the right people to finish it." They had faced down murderers, liars, and the ghosts of the past. They had untangled a web of deceit and stared into the abyss of losing everything. But in the end, they discovered that a home isn't something you inherit. It's something you build. A family isn't defined by blood or by law. It's forged in fire and chosen every single day. If you believe that the strongest families are the ones we choose for ourselves, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. You never know what story is waiting just around the bend.